Hey everyone, it's Mexi, and I am finally getting around to this radical food politics video. So this is going to be like my capitalism and the environment video where I do a broad overview and maybe I'll get into some other topics in follow-up videos, but there's a lot to cover and a lot that could be said or talked about, but yeah, obviously I just have to pick select few. So I want to start by saying that how we understand a problem is incredibly important because the solutions that we come up with are going to relate directly to how we understand that problem. For example, if we think of hunger as something that is natural or that is totally disconnected from social, political, or economic processes, or worse, if we think that poor people can't access food because they don't deserve it or just that they've made bad choices, then the solutions that we're going to propose are going to be things like food banks or charity, where our notion of how to fix the problem is going to center around different ways to just try to get more calories to more vulnerable people, instead of taking aim at the root causes of their poverty and vulnerability in the first place, and trying to ensure that they're never in a position to go hungry again. If we look at the root causes of poverty and insecurity and inability to access adequate food, then our gaze has to turn directly to our capitalist political economic system. Policies that aim to free the markets, reduce public spending and social safety nets, liberalize trade in line with corporate interests, and privatize and commodify food access and social rights contribute to the poverty that leaves many families unable to access adequate food. In 2004, the UNDP reported that we were producing enough food globally to feed every single person on the planet at least 2,500 calories per day. Today, on a global scale, we are producing 1.5 times more food than is needed to feed literally everyone. The problem is not scarcity, it's not underproduction, it's not even drought or calamity. This is an issue of distribution and access and the priorities of the global market. And in this capitalist system, only those with capital can access this vital necessity of life, and up to 50% of the food in this world is wasted instead of being distributed to the millions of people going hungry. In terms of priorities of the global market, an enormous amount of soy, grain, and corn are being grown and diverted to feeding cattle and other livestock on food lots instead of hungry people. As we talked about in our first podcast episode, food is literally being taken out of the mouths of hungry people to feed the unsustainable global meat industry for wealthy buyers. Capitalism as a system reproduces itself through the very fact that we all need food to live. That sticking point is capitalism's gotcha, because we've allowed food to be considered as a commodity, and so those of us who don't own the means of production, which is pretty much everyone, 99% of people, we have to sell our labor for a wage in order to buy food. And due to the kind of super exploitation that is made possible by this political economic framework, particularly a neoliberal framework, working 2 jobs, 3 jobs, working 16 hours a day doesn't even guarantee that you'll have enough money to access adequate food. If we think of food as a commodity that people don't deserve access to, then we're essentially letting society and governments off the hook. They don't have to ensure the welfare of their people. They don't have to ensure that people aren't starving in the streets. This is 100% in support of a neoliberal economic agenda. Charity can actually be a way for the welfare state to be rolled back, because charity will come in as a flanking mechanism and allow the state to just wither away and not pay attention to whether people are accessing food or not. While things like food banks and charity are good in the sense that they help desperate people in the short term, first of all, they tend to stigmatize poverty and stigmatize people who need to access them, and they do nothing to challenge the capitalist structures, liberalization, deregulation, privatization, and financialization that leave people in desperate states to begin with. And they do not challenge the understanding of food as a commodity and not as a social right. It supports and reinforces the status quo of inequality, and it sets up a situation where people will only get food if wealthy elite are benevolent enough to donate. According to Poppendieck, this ideology of voluntarism obscures the fundamental destruction of rights. It's not an accident that poverty grows deeper as our charitable responses to it multiply. the growth of kindness and the decline of justice are intimately intertwined. Eric Holt Gimenez, in his new book, A Foodie's Guide to Capitalism, does an excellent job at detailing how the relationship between capitalism and our food system is leading to a number of blatant crises and contradictions, which are only slated to get worse as major agribusiness companies seek out new markets and avenues for growth. I definitely don't have time to go into everything that he talks about in this video, so I really recommend reading this book. It's wonderful. But he discusses agriculture's role in dispossession and in primitive accumulation and the start of capitalism. And as we talked about in the structural adjustment video, flooding the market with similar crops makes the price drop. And then farmers who have been convinced through various programs to grow cash crops and abandon agroecology or subsistence agriculture, they must produce more and more and more just to make up for those losses. But of course, the more they produce, the more the market is flooded and the more the price drops. He discusses the example of the Great Depression, where you had lines and lines of people lining up to get bread, even while so much wheat was rotting in the silos. Overproduction in the North was used as a battering ram to open up grain markets in the global South, to the detriment of unsubsidized farmers in the South who could not compete. We have major corporations like Monsanto in charge of all of our seeds now, locking farmers into contractual servitude and leading to a number of suicides. The huge industrial monocrop harvesting is horrible for the environment and yields, but thanks to competition between firms, companies are forced to increase use of more and more chemicals and fertilizers just to keep their yields from dropping too much each year. It's been predicted even that our soils only have about 60 years of farming left if soil degradation continues apace. Anyway, there is a wealth of information in there that I suggest you explore, but he really demonstrates that we aren't going to get anywhere meaningful with a capitalist approach or within a capitalist framework. Approaches like devising new GM seeds or trying to inject more nutrition into the crops that we already have, or trying to make drought-resistant seeds, etc. to increase yields aren't going to actually solve the problem, because the problem is not one of underproduction. We already overproduce. We already produce 1.5 times more than we need. So producing more and putting more and more strain on our Earth's systems and on our soils is not going to solve the problems of distribution or private land and property regimes or financial speculation on agricultural land that is causing these problems. Reducing and redistributing food waste is a good idea that should be done. We should be doing that, obviously. But even these kind of strategies do not get at the heart of a system which is making work increasingly precarious and making it more and more difficult for people to actually make a living and earn living wages in order to access food. So I'm going to turn now to a few examples of organizations and movements that are trying to decommodify food, build alternative social relations around food access, food production, food distribution. So I'm going to start by describing 3, which are Via Campesina, Food Not Bombs, and Freeganism, and the Black Panther Party's free breakfast program for kids. And then I'll conclude by discussing to what extent I think that these ideas are going to be transformative. So La Via Campesina is an international movement that grew out of Latin America, which coordinates peasant organizations of small and middle-scale producers, agricultural workers, rural women, and indigenous communities from Asia, Africa, America, and Europe. It advocates for land reform, peasant rights, women's and indigenous people's rights, and against capitalism, free trade, and transnational agribusiness. They're a very large and well-known, well-organized movement that holds international conferences and seeks to forge an alternative to the colonial capitalist food system that dispossesses people from their land through land grabs or just undercutting local production. They're fighting to maintain peasant seeds as well and not allow companies like Monsanto to gain a monopoly on seeds and associated pesticides. And finally, there's a strong focus on food sovereignty. Food Not Bombs is a growing direct action social movement working to decommodify food and challenge the charity model. Food Not Bombs shares food free of charge, but not as a gift, as a means of asserting and fulfilling a right. There are over 500 autonomous chapters throughout the world, and each chapter is unique, so their range of action can be broad. Typically, they glean produce, if they can get it from local stores that be throwing away, or dumpster diving could be used as well. And then activists will cook the food and set it up and share it with whoever wants or needs any. They share pamphlets and information on political economy, mutual aid, and what they're all about. They try to break the charity model by inviting people who eat the food to contribute to gleaning, cooking, and logistics as well, thus truly creating mutuality and growing the movement to include more and more people dedicated to this decommodified way way of accessing and sharing food. What I also like is they mostly serve vegan food, unless of course they've gleaned something that is not fully vegan, of course they will serve it. Freeganism is quite similar. Freegans will dumpster dive and then organize to share food or whatever else they have acquired, like toiletries or clothing or school supplies or whatever they're able to glean from non-commodified sources.
It's a combination of the words free and vegan, both living freely, free from the oppression of a wage slave economy, and free in that you're not paying for things, not participating in a moneyed economy. Freeganism does not equal dumpster diving. There's freegans who don't dumpster dive, and people who garden, people who wild forage, people can grow their food. And there's lots of dumpster divers who aren't free. We're not just opting out of participating in the economy on a purchasing level, but for many of us, we're opting out in the, standard work a 9-to-5 job level.
I'm not sure if there's necessarily the same focus on growing the movement and, sharing information on political economy, but they do seek to decommodify food access and to not contribute to the exploitation of either animals or humans. The Black Panther Party's free breakfast for school children program was part of their revolutionary praxis. They understood that inadequate access to food in Black communities was keeping them down. Once again, relying on mutual aid, they understood that social reproduction at the community level was necessary for more widespread liberation through revolutionary praxis, and sought to create the conditions for liberation from the ground up. According to E. Cleaver, a prominent Black Panther, Breakfast for Children pulls people out of the system and organizes them into an alternative. Black children who go to school hungry each morning have been organized into their poverty, and the Panther program liberates them, frees them from this aspect of poverty. This is liberation in practice. This was actually the model and the impetus for all federally funded school breakfast programs in existence within the US today. In my opinion, even though programs like these are not going to shatter the bedrock of capitalism, I still think that they are vitally important, and especially vitally important in trying to build an eco-socialist future. Speaking again about prefigurative politics, it's vitally important that we actually get out and practice forging alternative social relations and forging new networks and new ways of conceptualizing what food production and distribution and access should look like. And in terms of growing a movement, I think that there is something so powerful about actually showing people our politics. Like, it's easy to say out loud, we want a world where children aren't going hungry and where people have access to food as a social right and not as a commodity. You can say that, but it's another thing to actually get out there and show people this is what we're about. If you want food, if you want liberation, then we're the ones with the vision. We're the ones who want to make that a reality. And in terms of, prefiguring environmental outcomes that we want to see, I think it's awesome that things like Food Not Bombs and the Freegan movement are thinking already about moving towards plant-based eating, plant-based production and distribution of food, and not the completely unsustainable and absurdly gross exploitative global meat industry. At the same time, of course, forging spaces that are kind of on the outskirts of capitalism, or forging places where people can access things in a decommodified way, doesn't actually, creating new alternative markets is not the same as changing the market structure that we're living in. And the strategies of something like Food Not Bombs, for example, or freeganism, this actually relies on the greater neoliberal capitalist model to produce the food, to overproduce the food, and produce this, waste that's able to then be gleaned and redistributed in a new way. So there are a lot of layers to this, but I think obviously we should not get too wrapped up in the idea of community or kind of cutting ourselves off from the broader economy, and not actually make sure to also simultaneously take aim at austerity, neoliberalism, and the global capitalist structures themselves that are producing all of these problems and will continue to produce them if we do not fundamentally shatter them. I would love to hear what you think, or if you have any examples of other really awesome radical food projects that are starting to forge these new relations and challenge these broader structures. So a very special thank you again to my patrons. I cannot express my gratitude enough. Check out my podcast at veganvanguardpodcast.com. Connect with me via Facebook or Twitter. Like, share, comment, subscribe, and I'll see you in another video.